Daniel, welcome to the Power to Be Happy podcast. I'm stoked that we're here having a conversation again, this time about quite a different topic, about a vital topic, about a necessary topic. I honor you for being here, for being in the space, for making the time for this. But I want to welcome you to the show. How you going, Daniel?
Hey Joe, yes, g'day. Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me along, and having one of our conversations.
Yeah, that's it, Daniel. And today we're talking about a difficult topic. I want to probably start with, how this conversation has come about.
Yeah.
And we've been doing some, workshops in the community, in the city council, but it's all really come about from the time when we were out in the bush, out in a walk, out in nature, and, becoming friends. And, I learned a lot about yourself, and also learned that you're a mental health professional in the space to do with suicide. And it was fascinating to me. I was like, so I remember just asking you, like, look, Daniel, like, why do people do it? And in that moment, Daniel, when you started to really break it down for me, and I remember we actually stopped, right? We stopped on the path, and it was like a sandy path, and Daniel actually started drawing out this diagram, right? Like you actually started drawing out on the ground and saying, here is like the three factors, here's how they come together. And I really, the part of me was like going, I was like, a part of me was excited to learn about it, but a part of me was also like flinching. I was almost wanted to run away. I felt lightheaded. I felt so overwhelmed because I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're talking about this. Like, stop. Like, it just wasn't, for me, it just made me so weird and uncomfortable. But that's when I also realized that this is a vital topic. This is a difficult topic, particularly for anyone with a history of mental ill health or who's been through difficult things in their life. So I think it's so vital to talk about it in a way of, how we can bring it out in, and talk about it in a way that is safe, or safe enough, I should say, using the language, and but also empowering. And so, I want to thank you for doing the work that you do in the space for so many years and supporting people. So thank you for what you're doing. And so tell us, what do we need to know about before we kind of get into the conversation of understanding suicide and how we can support ourselves and people around us? What do we need to know, Daniel?
Yeah, well, we need to know that suicide is a very confronting, it's a very emotive topic, as you've referred to, but we also know it affects pretty much all of us in one way or another. And when we had that talk, I remember the walk and the talk that we had, and getting down and drawing the diagram in the gravel, in the sand. But one of the things we talked about then was, I said there is research out there that indicates that for every person who dies by suicide, up to 134 people are affected, and that's the ripple effect. And so, at first I thought, well, that's a really large number. How does that make sense? But if we think about people are connected to communities in general, one way or the other, whether it's through school, work, family, social groups, sporting groups, and the impact of suicide goes well beyond those first degrees of contact as well. And that's when we're talking statistics, we start to talk about numbers and percentages and things, but that's the statistics that are recorded for suicide. That doesn't capture all of the times that people have attempted suicide, or they are other people that are having intense emotional crises and might be self-harming or thinking of self-harming. So that's really, in one sense, to use the bit of the cliche, that's actually the tip of the iceberg. So we know that in Australia, over 3,200 people die by suicide every year. That equates out to about 9 people a day in Australia dying by suicide. And we know that there are other parts of our population that are disproportionately affected, and those parts of the population generally we can define, if we want to talk about them in concrete terms, people who are parts of the communities that are stigmatised or marginalised, or find it much more difficult to access services. And that includes people in the LGBTIQA plus community and also our First Nations communities. And we know that the people in those communities are subject to more stresses in daily life and worse health outcomes overall, both physically and in mental health. And unfortunately, self-harm and suicide, deliberate self-harm and suicide are also a part of that picture. But so if we build on that, what's behind those statistics? One way of summarising that, Joe, is talking about connection, or in this case, lack of connection. And you and I were chatting about this a little bit earlier, and we were actually speaking with some people at the local city council earlier on. And it can be easy. I certainly found coming into this space, it can be easy to feel quite overwhelmed and get pushed into a space of hopelessness. But actually, in defining the problem, we can also start to indicate ways to find a solution, or even if we don't say solution, ways of responding and of improving things. So if we talk about lack of connection, that points to a way out for a lot of people, or what can we do if we're wanting to be supporters or helpers, is fostering connection. But we do know that for people who do decide that they want to end their life, that they feel that they have no other choice, they have no way out but to kill themselves, and often that is because they have overwhelming or unrelenting emotional suffering. That suffering can come from a whole range of different causes and sources. It's usually not simply one or only one thing, but a collection of things, or a building up and a layering of stressors and problems that over time build up. It can happen quite quickly, of course, but it can also build up over time in terms of, we talk about psychosocial losses. These are everyday stressors, but when they're cumulative, they can overwhelm someone's ability to cope or to connect. And that's things like financial stresses, housing, employment, vocational, relational, a whole series of things. And then these intersect with the person's situation and their context, whether they are part of a community that is more marginalised, if they're experiencing mental health stressors, and a whole range of factors. So that's why in talking about suicide, the field talks far more about understanding and responding now. When I started working in this area, probably specifically about 10 years ago, we used to talk about predicting and preventing. And we kind of know those approaches don't get the best results, and so trying to understand the individual in their context. So we know about more than 3,200 Australians die by suicide on average in a year. We know that about 3/4 of those are actually men. And we know that there are some key periods across the lifespan. It affects people across the lifespan. But in fact, people in later adolescence, people in middle age, and actually people in more advanced age groups, in above 75, 80 plus, people in those groups are more prominently represented in the data. But the data talks of in generalities, in large numbers. It's helpful in guiding us and setting the scene, but it doesn't tell us about the individual context of the person that we're sitting with. Yeah.
Exactly. And I love that you bring though that context in, because I think it's so important. And it really brought home for me when you said that, that this many people die by suicide, that it's more, I think you were saying it's more than people who die in on the roads, right? In car crashes. So that really puts things in the context, like how big of a challenge it is for our society, for our culture, to bring suicide into finding more helpful ways to deal with it. Yeah. But then I wanna transition into talking about when we're dealing with our own stress, with our own challenges, but also that of people in our life, whether that's someone that might be a friend, that might be a loved one, that might be your partner, that might be someone you work with, or just someone in the community. How do we approach, how do we kind of try to understand where they might be at? If we see that someone is not acting in the way that they usually do, how do we try to gauge where they're at, and then kind of, is it even safe to bring up a topic of suicide?
Yeah. That's and so really good question there, Joe. And perhaps I'll begin with the last part there. That in terms of the understanding in the mental health field, we know that it is safe to bring up the topic of suicide, It's not that we talk about it gratuitously, of course, but that indeed, and I had this in when I was going through my training, I had a fear that if I asked someone were they at risk of suicide or were they feeling suicidal, that I would somehow prompt them or put that idea in their head. And we know that that's actually not the case. And we know that if someone is struggling or in crisis, quite often they actually feel burdened. They might feel ashamed, they might feel hopeless or helpless, they might feel that no one understands them or that no one else has ever felt how they feel. So by actually addressing the topic or bringing the topic up directly, usually that actually has a much more beneficial effect. It lets the person know that we're interested and sincere, and it can help to immediately start to mitigate that sense of isolation or shame, the fact that someone is interested enough and cares enough and is willing to take the time and stop and ask. Of course, thoughtfully, sensitively. So yeah, you talked about we might notice someone's changed, and that's actually the key stepping in point. Some of the signs when someone is struggling is actually of some of those external changes, whether it be in their behaviours or their routine, how they look, even their body language. Are they much more, down and unhappy and reserved or withdrawn? Of course, there can be lots of reasons for those things going on, and people can have a whole bunch of problems that they're grappling with and struggling with. It doesn't mean that they're suicidal. But in terms of the topic that we're working today and working around today, it is about being alert to and sensitive to signs of distress, because as biological organisms, we're kind of programmed, we're hardwired for survival. So for someone to attempt to end their life or for someone to kill themselves, we've actually got to, generally speaking, we've got to overcome a whole lot of innate instinct to preserve our life. And so people can find themselves thinking along those lines when they have what they feel is overwhelming, unbearable, and oftentimes inescapable suffering. It could be physical pain along with emotional pain. And so when we notice changes in people's behaviour, their appearance, or the things that they're saying, then we can start to be, the radar's out there, the radar's scanning, and we start to want to respond. But to respond, of course, sensitively, compassionately, and really there's no there's no particular guidebook in terms of required steps, but it's some fundamental principles. And so that's coming from a sense of being authentic, ideally being able to take some time. So it's often, there may not be a better time, so it might have to be a rushed conversation, but where possible, being sensitive again to the time, the place, the setting, and also respectful of the other person, and really doing whatever we can to communicate that, openness, an accepting attitude, and very much what we call a non-judgmental attitude, because that person's suffering or their distress, that's unique and individual to them, and we can't really ever know what that is like or how much they're struggling. So yeah, being alert to signs of distress, being willing to actually make a move forward and reach out, or as is commonly talked about nowadays, reaching out, but connecting or opening and inviting someone into a conversation.
That makes so much sense. Like, I know some of it, we'll talk about like how do you start that conversation. Maybe we'll kind of even, I don't know, even role play something like that. But I want to touch on what are some of the things like we don't want to say, right? Because we want to be able to have that, as you say, compassionate, authentic conversation. What are some of the things we don't want to say in that type of a conversation?
And I'm glad you asked that, Joe. And I do often think about it in terms of, especially, in terms of, I'm someone who enjoys humour, and I know you have a great sense of humour, and we're always joking with each other. And from when I'm got my mental health clinician hat on, I'm thinking, well, where's the humour? Where does the humour stop, or the blokey humour stop? And where does some real concern start? So some everyday phrases that we use. And they're of course, we're not saying we're not wanting to inhibit people's speech, but if you are concerned about someone, we want to be talking in a way that helps them to feel safe enough, respected, and that this is an accepting and authentic kind of space. So if we start with things like, oh, don't worry, I'm sure it's nothing, or oh, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? These are all things that we say. We might say that to ourselves or amongst our family in a day-to-day conversation. We're not. I'm not kind of talking about that. But if we are opening a sensitive conversation, we've seen some signs of distress. We're really wanting to inquire authentically and build some trust, build some mutual rapport and respect, avoiding saying things like, yeah, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? Or, oh, surely it can't be as bad as all that. Those are phrases that are going to close down the conversation. They're not going to invite someone to feel secure enough. If they're already feeling vulnerable, if they're already feeling, they might be actually judging themselves and criticizing themselves, and they may feel that they have a terrible burden and they couldn't possibly open up to anybody. So we need to start the conversation if we can. We all make slips and trips. I'm sure if I watch back the podcast, I'll hear myself saying things. I'm like, oh, why did you say that? So it's not about being the word police on each individual word, but getting a handle on those concepts very much. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that, Daniel. So true. And so we're gonna know what not to say, but I mean, how would we gauge that? How would we bring up with the person that something is different, as you were saying, something changed, right? How do we have that conversation, especially if the person who might be in distress, who might be dealing with things, who might be dealing with things from the past, who might be dealing with challenges now? How do we bring it up in a way that, because they're not likely to just immediately just unload everything on you, right? Like, how do we have that conversation while being respectful, but also bringing up those concerns in a way that we don't just stop right away, right?
Yeah. So of course, and you and I have spoken about this in the past, where I could say, so it's about noticing things. Joe's normally really bubbly. He's normally very talkative, and of course, if I see you one day and you're a bit down and flat, okay, that might be fine. But if I'm seeing you consistently or over a period, I might be saying, oh, Joe, I'm just wondering, I'm wondering how things are going. You seem a bit down, And of course, we know you might just shake that off and brush that off, or say, no, I'm fine. Now, depending on what else I know about the situation and about you and what other signs or indicators are going on, I might might leave it at that, because I do need to respect you and trust you. In order to build trust and rapport, I've got to be able to accept what you say as well. However, I can also speak truly to my own experience. So it's not about me talking at you about yourself, but I can authentically then say, oh, you know what, look, I'm glad to hear, Joe, but I've got to say, from the way I see things, you've really changed a lot recently, and it makes me worry about you. So, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I really do want to check, are you really okay? Is there something more going on? Is there something worrying you or troubling you? Yeah. Yeah. So you see, I started that by actually talking about because I've asked you and you said, no, I'm fine. You said,
yes.
I don't want to talk about it. Drop it. Leave me alone. Whatever. Don't bother me. Yeah. And if I feel that there is a need or it's important, well, I can revisit that, but I'm doing so now from my perspective, what I'm seeing and hearing and how it's making me feel in relation to you.
So cool, because that's non-judgmental, right?
Yeah.
That's just bringing your own experience in it, and that way I'm not feeling, or the person you're talking to is not feeling kind of judged immediately, right? That you are like this or you are like that. It's kind of talking about your own perspective. So let's just say the person brings up the fact that there is things going on. They're stressed. They may have experienced or maybe experiencing some difficulties now. Like how do we talk around that?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things is to what we call validate that and acknowledge it first of all, because I've asked you, and now you're opening up.
You'll say it's not great. This and this part or whatever.
Yeah. And now you've opened up a bit. I need to honour that and respect that and say, okay, I might say, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you felt you could tell me, or thanks for opening up, or thanks for letting me know. Yeah. So first of all, acknowledging what's been said. Yeah. Importantly, you said what not to say. At times we're going to move to a solution. Like let's find a way out of this, or what are we going to do next, or let's put some plans in place. But if someone's really suffering and struggling, we don't want to just come in and shut it. It can be a closing down again just to offer a solution. That's pretty similar as kind of dismissing it or minimizing it. Just say, oh, we'll just do this. Yeah, because if I go to that problem solving and that fixing, and look, that's always my first urge. I've got a lot of training and a lot of experience in the mental health field, and I still have to have a little kind of voice in the back of my head saying, "Don't go to problem solving straight away, Daniel."
It's me.
So
as well.
it's a normal reaction. So it's not wrong. But if we are having these sensitive conversations, we've actually got to be, as much as we can, prepared to tolerate that distress. Because, when there's distress or fear or whatever it is, there's a couple of main reactions people know, fight, flight, freeze, and there's a few others we can build onto that. But so if someone talks about a problem, one instinctive reaction is to kind of avoid it and run away, and that might be why I don't even ask you. Or another then is to make it go away by fixing it. Yeah. But if I try and do that, I'm not actually listening to you and understanding what's going on for you. So asking about how the person's feeling, kind of attempting to empathise with that, or at least even if I can't understand it, again, you can pretty rarely go wrong by being authentic and talking about your own experience. So I might even say, you might tell me the dilemma or the problem. I say, wow, I guess from my experience, that's something I've never really encountered, but I can see or I can hear or I can sense or I can feel that it's really troubling you. Yeah. So I need to be able to validate that and acknowledge it. You might even say, look, thank you so much for trusting me with this, Joe. Or because if we think about it, I might be, now that I've asked that question, I might be the first person in your entire life you've talked to about this topic or about how you're feeling right now. Yeah. So acknowledge it, allow it to be there without running away and without trying to close it down and fix it. Doesn't mean, of course, approving of it, but acknowledging that that's there and that it's real for the person, and thanking them essentially for opening up their zone of trust to you.
Yeah. So powerful, and it's that being authentic. It's just really listening in. It's just having that back and forth to try to really understand what's really going on for that person. And let's just say that you notice that in that conversation that you can sense that the person is going through a tough time. They brought it up in some way, and you sense that they're not in a good space. They're struggling. Right? How do we then, let's just say we talked about
how do we move from they're struggling to I'm worried that you might be thinking of suicide.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. There's a couple of broad ways. I'll try and not make it overly complicated, but one we might call the normalizing or external viewpoint, and the other is this person specific or internal viewpoint. So, you might tell me that certain things have happened in your life, or this is what's going on for you at the moment, or things have happened in the past and now it's come back and affected you. So I've acknowledged the reality of that. I've expressed some empathy and sympathy or some support, and I've thanked you for trusting me. And then if nothing explicit has come out, but I'm worried about it, I can say, Joe, often when people are experiencing those kinds of things, sometimes they can get into a crisis situation and they can even start thinking about suicide. I'm just wondering, have you been thinking about suicide? Yeah. So that's that external or normalizing perspective. There's a mental health professional. He's actually a psychiatrist in the US called Sean Shea. And he has a clinical institute that he's founded there. He's published several books and techniques and strategies on how to ask questions about sensitive subjects. Can be about mental health, can be about physical health. And of course, mental health and suicide are very sensitive and sometimes even taboo subjects. So he coined this, he labelled that the normalising approach, saying lots of other people who have been in similar situations have felt this, just wondering if that's how it's affecting you. Yeah. The other way is Sean Shea calls shame attenuation, but it's what I call that internal or personalising approach. So, and I might use that particularly if I know you a little better. Yeah, or we've got a closer relationship. I might say, you know what, Joe? Just hearing about all of that makes me think. I'm wondering about you, and I'm wondering about if you've been having, given everything that's happened to you and how you told me you're feeling. See how I've gone from when other people feel like that. In this version of it, I've gone to how you're feeling. I'm wondering how that's affecting you, and I've seen how withdrawn you are. I'm worried, I'm wondering, have you been thinking about suicide? Yeah. I shouldn't, by the way, if we go back and watch it, I probably wouldn't have said worried, because I don't want you to then worry about me worrying about you, if I can put it that way.
Exactly, but then again, I think that's also true, because you're not ever going to be in a place where you can perfectly.
You haven't got the script there perfectly. You're
not going to say, my dear friend.
But that was just a little. It's like, oh, hang on.
Sorry, dear friend. Let me rewind and use the right one. No, that's totally right. But I want to also focus on the fact that we are being, like, you've been very specific, right? We're not, again, we talked about, things we want to avoid using the saying, you're not thinking of doing something stupid or something silly or whatever. Like, we've been very direct, right? So we're saying things like suicide, killing yourself, right?
And just before I do respond to that, I've talked about the two approaches: internal, external, general, personal. Neither one of those is right, or more right than the other. It depends on the situation, the feel. If you don't know what to do, just mentally flip a coin and choose one. It doesn't really particularly matter, in most circumstances.
And you could probably even switch between them, even in the context of one conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but so then to come to the question you asked now, yes, is we're being very direct, because if we're actually concerned about a suicide risk, we're going to have this conversation meaningfully, we need to actually know what we're talking about. Yeah. Because there's many of times, as you said, I work as a mental health professional, and sometimes I'm interviewing someone and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is where the conversation's going. It might be suicide, it might be anywhere else. And it's not until I ask those clarifiers, and just as many times it's not mentally, I'm like, oh, okay, I was on the wrong track. We're not heading down this pathway. It's about something else. Or you might be telling me about your problems, and you've the example we've used today is when to say someone's lost their job, and I that's why I have to understand what is the meaning and the impact on that person. Because to me, for instance, losing my job, that would be, oh my goodness, this is terrible, this is a disaster. How am I going to pay my rents and all of this kind of thing? So if I think about it from my point of view, I'm going to impose that view on you. That's why I need to put my own perspective aside and be genuinely there to find out your perspective. Because for every time that someone loses their job and I say, oh my goodness, that's terrible, you poor thing, how are you going to cope? They might go, yeah, it's great, I really wanted to get out of there and I've got this fantastic opportunity. Yeah, so I'm not, we're wanting to have a laugh about it, but I'm not joking about that. It's about the person, what the person's perception and interpretation of those events are, because you might be really down on it because to play with the job theme, you might have decided you're taking your career in another direction and you're feeling really bad because you don't want to tell your boss, because you've got a really good boss, really good company, really good manager, whatever it is, and you feel like you might let them down. So in that little scenario that I've just painted, you're actually feeling really down because you've got an exciting project, but you're worried about how it's going to impact on you. So until I find out the extent of that feeling, I might be trying to problem solve something that's not there.
Yeah, totally. And I love that, because that's goes back to that again, being authentic and listening. And so let's just touch on that for just a moment, because I think that's so vital, like especially for people like me who love to jump in and problem solve, or sometimes attempt to kind of assume things, right? Because if this is how I am, that must be how everyone else is. Like, how do we become more, I guess, empathetic and really trying to listen by taking the other person's perspective in a way that is there's really compassionate.
Well, it's those, and you pretty much answered provided the answer in the question, in that it's about the very present, what we call active listening. And in fact, I've worked in mental health for 20 years now. And it's only about 2 or 3 years ago, I actually discovered a deeper meaning of empathy. I thought I knew what sympathy and empathy was, and it wasn't, in fact, until I was running courses and running workshops in these areas. And so I used to think that empathy was me putting myself in your position. So mentally, me imagining what's it like for me, Daniel, being sitting there in Joe's chair, running the podcast. Yeah. That's wrong. I had that wrong.
Ouch.
What empathy actually, like radical empathy, is actually me doing what I can to imagine what it's like for you in your chair. Not what would it be like for me in your chair, but what is it actually like for you? Yeah, and we can never know truly. But in one of our other conversations about this topic, I know on the weekend, and I mentioned it's something you can Google on YouTube, or look up on YouTube. There's an interview, and the guys in Northwest Mental Health actually put me onto this little clip. It's about 2 minutes long. And it's a fellow it's a news report about interview with this fellow, Daniel, the bus driver. And I won't talk you through it now in detail. If people are interested, they can look that up. But Darnell's actually a bus driver in the US driving across a bridge with a busload of commuters in the peak hour, morning peak. And there's someone on the bridge, and they're actually on the other side of the railing, on the pedestrian bridge. There's a car bridge, a pedestrian walkway, and a railing. So Darnell, he stops the bus in the middle of traffic. Yeah, he calls back to base to ask them to call the ambulance. And he gets out and he actually goes up to the person, and he doesn't rush at them. He's a really big guy. It's quite a small person, small woman on the other side of the railing. And Darnell's a bus driver on a busy bus route in the morning. And he's put himself in that person's position. You know, it seems kind of really obvious, but he's noticed it and he's stopped. Cars are going past, people are cycling past. You can see in the footage from the dash cam in the bus. And Darnell he realizes there's someone in distress. You know, who's going to respond? So he gets out, he stops the bus, gets out, and he just says to the lady, "Ma'am, would you like to come back onto this side of the railing?" Yeah. So he's responding to what's there. He doesn't need to ask her, what problems she's got. He doesn't need to ask her how she's feeling about them. Yeah, in that sense. So we don't want to overly complicate it. That's why I love talking. That's why I love this example. Sometimes when we run a workshop for professionals, I show that at the end of the day. I say, okay, we've just spent 8 hours learning all of the theory and the techniques and practicing them. And here's a bus driver that can do the whole thing in 2 minutes. Yeah. Because he just says, "Ma'am, would you like to come back on this side of the railing?" Yeah. Yeah. And as I mentioned to you, Joe, he's a big guy. The lady in particular is quite small stature. He actually sits down on the ground. So that they're on the same level. Yeah. So this guy's brilliant. Yeah. He plays American football and he drives a bus and he does a perfect suicide awareness and response. Yeah. In 2 minutes.
Love it, Daniel. I think that's such a perfect example of how you kind of cut straight to the chase, right? You don't, and obviously every situation is different.
Every situation is different.
But still, sometimes you can just be there. And I think that's what we're talking about, what you're really talking about, that right level of empathy. You've been there with the person in the moment. You don't bring your own opinion, perspective, judgment. You're there, you're helpful, you're ready to listen, you're ready to support.
Yeah.
Now, let's just say the person you're talking to maybe you ask them in a way that is direct and will not be misunderstood, right? Are you considering suicide, or have you had thoughts about killing yourself? Now, let's just say the person said, "Yeah, you know what? That's something that's come up," or whatever way they say it. Like, what do we say or do then?
Yeah. And I'm thinking back to the start of this conversation this afternoon. There's going to be clues in that already as to how can we respond. Yeah, because there's some understanding of what's going on for them, but also to remember, as we've just spoken about, bringing in, referencing the general response that Darnell epitomised, is that people often have their own resources, their own ways of coping. In times of crisis or stress, they can actually lose touch with those or forget about them. So it's not all about an expert mental health clinician intervention, that there's someone else who can magically sail in and keep someone safe. There's a whole range of things. I often talk about it in terms of a pyramid, or that sort of triangle at the base of the person's own resources. Now, for that example with Darnell and the woman on the bridge, her own internal coping resources, they're overwhelmed at that point. But for the rest of us in our own conversations, in our own lives, for ourselves or our loved ones or people we work with or people we know, not to forget those things. So that's like our walk. That's how we got started on this conversation, Joe. Yep. because you ring me up or message me, Daniel, when are we going for a walk? Yep.
Yeah.
Because that time just doesn't arrive by itself, does it?
No.
We have to make a conscious decision to make that happen. I have to put it in my diary. I have to make sure I protect that time. And sometimes I ring up and go, Joe, sorry, I can't make it. We'll do it next week or the week after. Yeah. But there are internal coping mechanisms. That's things like going out in the garden, reading a book, calling a friend, going for a walk to the beach, patting a dog, all of those things. So I mention that because it's important not to lose sight of those.
Yes.
Yeah. And to know that there's a whole way of responding and supporting. So some of those things are those internal, what we call it, those things, self-directed things that we already have or know. I was speaking to someone once, and they were actually quite an accomplished musician, and they played a number of instruments, and they were in a really quite a terrible situation. And I said to them, the weekend's coming. I said, you're going to play one of your instruments. And they kind of looked at me and they're like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you've just been telling me you'd play this and this and this and this. And they said, oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Of course, they hadn't forgotten, but they had lost touch with that. They had become disconnected with that. And I asked them about it. So we settled on one of the instruments. I said, where is it? They said, oh, it's in my wardrobe, at the back of the wardrobe, up the top shelf at the back of the wardrobe. I said, do you reckon when you get home you could take that out? And maybe on the weekend you could play that instrument? Yep. So I'm not being flippant about this. Everyone has some sort of way of coping that they've forgotten about or they've lost touch with, and usually that can be reactivated. Then there's next thing up the pyramid is this social contact, and there's kind of just connecting with people, catching up with friends, inviting a friend for coffee. And there's two ways of doing that. One way can be, if you like, keeping that privately to yourself. Like, I want to catch up with my friend, let's go see a movie, or let's go for a coffee, or let's go for a walk at the beach. And I'm just making use of that social connection to help sustain myself. I don't, for whatever reason, I don't want to open up to them. I might not need to, but I'm reinvigorating that social connection. The next level is what we might do, because we talk about these issues. I would feel quite comfortable. There's lots of people I wouldn't ring up and say, oh my gosh, I'm having an emotional crisis. I don't think I cope. Could you come and help me? Yeah. Okay. I know they would, but I would feel really awkward about that.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't feel awkward calling you up
Yes.
and having that conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Because I know through our conversations we've already had about this topic, I know that you would want to be involved.
Yes.
Yeah, and I know that I wouldn't have to start back at 0 or 1 out of the conversation. I could start right where we are in the conversation. So there's social contact that's kind of more general, and then there's the more specific, that trusted friend, the mentor, the person you've shared all sorts of troubles with in the past, that sort of connection. And then there's the professionals. Yep. So it can be counsellor, GP, can be a drop-in centre. We were around in Frankston last week, and they've got a drop-in centre through the library, through the council there, where there's some social workers on hand. So people might know about those local resources. And then there's more specific. There's going to the GP and saying, actually, I think I need to speak to a mental health professional, mental health social worker, or a psychologist. Yeah. Then the top of that pyramid is actually the acute health services. And so they're things like the 000 emergency line, or the local crisis team, or the emergency department. And you can go and seek help there. If that's not the right spot, they'll tell you, they'll let you know, and redirect you to where is the right spot. So you don't have to solve that puzzle yourself. If you're struggling yourself or trying to help someone, you don't have to get all the answers right. But that's a little bit of a, if you like, a bit of a hierarchy, and it shouldn't be stepwise. You can weave all of those things in together. The other thing you've often asked me about is also about those helplines, and I think Headspace and Beyond Blue, they also have some online chat groups, and some of those are 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not all of them are. Some of them are. And the people there are trained and experienced. They will, if it's appropriate for them to help you in that at that moment, they will. And if it needs something more, they'll actually let you know and help to connect you in. So you've been, you know, we've been doing this sort of little bit, almost a role play, not quite a role play, but, you know, Daniel and Joe, and I'm asking you, and you've opened up. So there might be a time where I say, Joe, I'm really worried about you, and I think we need to call someone straight away. Can we do that? Yeah. And if it seems that serious, I need to stay with you until we can make that call, until we can get the professionals involved. Other times, no, it's fine. It's like, okay, you know, he's telling me he's on top of it. You know, I know he's going back home. I know his situation there. There's going to be someone at home. And so we're getting into the realm now of what we call safety planning. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. By the way, in case I forget about, there's a really good safety planning app available. It's developed. It originally comes out of the work of of some researchers in the US called Barbara Stanley and Gregory Brown around US veterans. So guys, men and women from the armed services returning from conflict zones. And when they were having a crisis, they might be in their town. They mightn't even know where the local hospital is, or what's the phone number for the crisis service. So they realised even if we just get a piece of paper and write down, you know, the phone number for the hospital. So when we're not in a crisis, we can think, we can plan, we can generate, and we start to lay down some of those ideas, some of those pathways in our neuronal systems. When we're in crisis, we talk about the blinkers coming on. We're more pessimistic. We're not creative. We can't generate solutions. And if we see outcomes, we usually assume they'll be negative. So we put some of that work in when things aren't so bad into some safety planning. And yeah, if people look up, it's Beyond Now. It was auspiced originally from the work of Stanley and Brown. It was auspiced under Beyond Blue, but they've now handed that over to Lifeline, the people behind Lifeline. And so a quick internet search, if you put in Lifeline Beyond Now safety planning, it'll take you there. It's free, of course. There's an app you can download for your phone. And that's probably what I'd recommend, but you can also do a web-based version on the computer. And it's got the reasonable categories about warning signs, ways of connecting, contact numbers, professional help. But importantly, with safety planning too, again, it's not about jumping in totally with solutions, but looking about what's underlying that and looking at meaning or reasons for living. So when we think about safety planning, well, what are the reasons for living? Now, sometimes people will say there aren't any. And that's their experience. But that's also, remember I said, for every problem, the solution is kind of contained in that. It's like, okay, now we know what we need to work on. Yeah, where this is what we can think about. This is what we can experiment with. So safety planning might take the time. So it might cover an hour. You know, someone's disclosed to me that they're really very much on the verge of making a serious suicide attempt. Yeah, I need to stay with them. Need to make a call, need to involve them in that discussion as much as possible. But I also might have to override their wishes. Yeah? If they tell me they're at imminent risk to themselves or someone else, I've actually got a duty and obligation, an ethical and a moral obligation to respond and call for help. Yeah? Safety planning that I talked about through the Beyond Now app, that's a work in progress. And in fact, some other people I've worked with in the UK, an organisation called For Mental Health, they actually advocate that everybody has a safety plan, even if you have no history of suicidal thinking, even if you don't have a mental health history. Because, of course, crises don't arrive at convenient times. Yeah. You know? Whenever I talk about this, I see a lot of people in the group or in the workshop nodding. Crises don't arrive at like 10 a.m. on a sunny Tuesday morning. Of course, sometimes they do. I'm not minimising people's, adverse events can happen to people all the time. But generally, crisis situations, they're at 1 o'clock in the morning, on a Saturday or a Sunday or a public holiday. Yeah. So we need to have had things put in place already, if we can, that we can activate. And so having put some time into the safety planning, we've already got some things in mind. So that short-term planning, but also that longer-term piece of work. And that might involve, well, I do want to see a counsellor, but it's hard to find someone. You put a lot of information out through the work that you do and through this podcast about people finding a journey to finding what is helpful therapy or what is useful counselling or support for them. And so that takes time. So if it takes time, it means we kind of need to get to work now. And what the people at For Mental Health, they shared with me, and I love talking about it with other people. Those crises, they come from left field. The ones that undo us, Usually we can't see them coming, or if we see them coming, we don't get to pick the time. And so they talk about it being like driving a car and having a safety belt and an airbag. In Australia, we've got compulsory seatbelt laws. We do have a lower road toll as a result of that, no matter what anyone thinks of seatbelts. But I don't, when I drove over here today, I thought, I didn't think, I'll probably have an accident today, so I'm going to put my seatbelt on. Yeah. And yesterday I didn't think, no way I'm having an accident today, so I don't need it. I won't wear it. Yeah. We just put that safety belt on. If we can, we have a car with an airbag in it, because we actually accept that when that crisis is going to arrive, it can arrive really unexpected and at the worst possible time. So I need to have that safety belt already fitted to my car, and I need to put it on. Yeah, and that's the same with the safety planning. So even if it's this discussion that we're having, we're activating ideas in each other's brains, people listening and watching, they're kind of getting ideas. So all of that's feeding into this, okay, if I was struggling, or someone I love or someone I know or someone I just pass in the street is struggling, what could I actually do? So that's the essence of safety planning. Sometimes it's just in the next hour or the next day, hey, is my friend Joe going to be okay till I meet him tomorrow morning? And then we make a further plan. Or we go down to the hospital, or he's going to, I'm going to sit with him while he calls his GP and gets an emergency appointment in the next day or two. Yeah. As well as the longer term safety planning that we might do through things like the Beyond Now app.
Yeah, I love it, Daniel. And I love the metaphor that you used of seatbelt, right? Like we want to try and do things beforehand, so that when the crisis hits, there's something that helps us, that helps our friends, our loved ones, that we can kind of deal with it better when, those blinkers might be on, where we might be in that space where we don't see those other options, where we might not have immediate access to our own resources. Yeah. I was really moved by you bringing up that example with the professional musician, right? Like that, how the person was in a state of distress where they were, even something that brought them so much joy, so much passion, is something that was sidelined because of that they were going through a difficult time. Yeah. So maybe like let's touch on that, and let's touch on, because I think like self-care to me is really all about connecting with those resources that you might already have.
You might take them for granted, or you've forgotten about them.
Exactly. Like let's just talk about that. Like, what are some of the things about self-care? Like especially, and I guess self-care is in a way part of that safety plan, right? Like when because we all, like we don't just becoming resilient. Is it something that we do when the crisis happens, right? Yeah. It's something we hopefully can build up onto it. Just like in a way, for example, if we want to be fit, like we want to be doing something consistently that helps us.
I can't just decide today I want to be fit and go to the gym tomorrow and do an 8-hour session.
And then
bang,
and then you magically.
I made the decision and I did the hard work, and now I'm fit. Yeah, it takes time to build up, and there's ups and downs, of course, on the roads. It's not a straight pathway. So of course, a lot of those things are things that we've been told, or we know, or we tell other people, and that's like looking after things, trying as much as possible to look after healthy eating, getting enough sleep. Getting a reasonable amount of exercise. But it's also reaching that point of accepting, maybe I have got to invest something deliberate in looking after myself a little bit so that I can keep going. So it's not perfecting everybody or kind of getting a rule book out. And we often, when we are younger, in our teenage years or our 20s, we can get away with not sleeping, maybe using plenty of alcohol or other things, and not having a really clear diet. But over time, those things, they don't bolster our ability to cope. Actually, if they're covered, we can cope with everything a little bit better. It's not going to solve everything. Yeah, a healthy diet is not going to solve everything, but it can help to underpin, or healthy eating can help to underpin that. And it doesn't mean we have to be like that all the time or every day. But if we're kind of working towards that, as you say, something that really helps people is pets. Yeah. Often, and there's the dog people and the cat people, and then there's other pet people as well. But certainly, pets, and there's certainly the research and plenty of science to back that up. That having a pet and stroking a pet or looking after a pet, looking after someone else, anyone else, can actually have benefits for us. Yeah. And one thing that people, I know, lots of people who have dogs, I don't have a dog, I don't have a dog at the moment, but they know, they say, oh, I've got to get out for a walk because the dog makes me. Yeah. Because the dogs, doesn't matter if it's a public holiday or, well, sometimes some dogs, if it's raining, they won't go out. But yeah, dogs don't they don't pay attention to if you're sick or if it's a public holiday or if it's a bit cold. They want to go out for that walk. Yeah, especially in most urban environments too. If you're walking a dog, I do know this from when I have had dogs, you end up going to a park, and what do you run into at the park?
People with dogs.
People with dogs, yeah. And you actually I used to know all the dogs' names, but I didn't know the owners' names. They were just, Fido's dad and Spot's mum. But allowing some of those things to be in place. And then there's other more deliberate things, as we've referenced, and that might be, whether it be, we know there are benefits, mind-body benefits for physical activity. Physical activity improves our physical health. It also improves our mental health. And not everyone has the same range of opportunities or abilities. So it's working out, what works for you. For some people, it's training for a marathon or running a marathon. And of course, if I look in the media, there's people that can run 7 marathons in a week. But it's not about, if that's what works for them, if that's what works for you, great. But it's not about that. But it is, will I get out and go for a walk to the park, or will I think about getting a pet? I can't have a dog, and I like cats, so I have a cat. Yeah. These might sound really matter of fact, everyday stuff, and I guess harking back to something I said earlier, just because they are doesn't mean that they aren't valuable. And they're not going to jump in and solve the problem on their own. We know that, we understand that, but just to emphasise that, if for people who are listening and thinking about applying that for themselves, all of these things actually add up, and they all bring some benefits with them. And they all, even if we're really struggling, they buy us time to get through to the next day. Yeah.
Exactly, and it makes me think about those protective layers in that context. And I know you also mentioned, I just want to bring up something that I remember that I think is really important, that really stood out to me when you were talking about in a workshop the other day, is that when someone often has, thoughts about suicide that, they can be quite intense, but they're often short-lasting. I just wanted to quickly touch on that.
Yep.
That's the case, isn't it?
Yeah. As much as we understand that, and there are people who have studied this and professionals who have worked with people during and a suicidal crisis and people who have survived a suicide attempt. And we know that the thoughts come and go, absolutely. And I don't want anyone hearing this to misconstrue what I'm saying. They can go, but they come and go, and they're short-lived. And generally speaking, the most intense suicidal thoughts, I associate it with that intensity. It can't be maintained. It can't maintain itself. So they're short-lived. So that intense suicidal urge or impulse can be quite short-lived. So it's about being able to get through that for ourselves, or if we're supporting people, and this is where I think we're talking about it. So it can be about diverting or distracting. Yes. Yeah. And it's actually, again, I'm not trivializing it. We think if anyone's ever been a smoker and tried to stop smoking or any other kind of, addictive behavior, those urges can be very, very strong. But we actually learn if we can ride out that urge, the intensity, it might still be there, and we know it could come back, but that intense urge, I have to act now, that's actually quite short-lived. So
exactly. And I think that's so important to bring up, because then those protective layers, those self-care routines, if you will, or that just authentic, compassionate conversation with a friend, that can sometimes make all the difference. Isn't it? And sometimes that's when you can then, hopefully access to things that you love doing, maybe your passions, maybe your hobbies, maybe rediscovering something that was put aside, that maybe just, life got in the way and you didn't get around to, either that, playing that sport or playing that instrument or, doing that thing with a friend. So those things become really vital, don't they? Including including things like therapy, you know.
Well, that's why, if I can just jump in there, Joe,
Yes.
that's because, yes, they are very short-lived. And it can be about distracting or diverting or getting through this hour, you know, this tonight or this day, this 24 hours. But also, yeah, as I said, I don't want to minimize that. Sometimes people experience that recurrently.
Yes.
So yeah, okay, it's short-lived, but it's going to be back, and it's back again and again and again, to the point where it feels unrelenting. And people can become really quite sensitized to that even when there is relative peace, they're actually on edge because they know it's going to come back, or they fear it's going to come back. So that's indeed where we want to talk about. If that's the situation, it is important to think about, where is the scope? And that's where I think you were going now. Where is the scope for some sort of deliberately undertaking some sort of therapeutic endeavor as well?
Exactly. And, exactly right. And I feel like for me, therapy has been something that had a lot of self-labeling around therapy. And I was like, well, if, up until, several years ago, I was like, thought, well, if I go into therapy, like, what is it going to solve? Or like, if I go into therapy, does this mean that I'm broken? Or like something is truly wrong with me? But also another thing that was like coming up for me is like, well, what if I do therapy and it doesn't help? Then I'm really screwed.
Yeah, I'm really, yeah.
Like then that means like so there's a sense of like there's a lot of barriers that get in the way, especially for many of us who may have, for example, tried, having a conversation with a mental health professional or a GP or whoever else, right, in that kind of that space, and maybe that conversation wasn't helpful or wasn't what you kind of expected, and you're kind of going, well, I'm not going to do that now, right?
Yeah. Now I'm in the worst position. As I said, look, I gave it a go. Yep. And it didn't work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just want to just get your thoughts on that as well, because obviously, you know a lot about that space, being a clinician as well. So what are your thoughts about, therapy and how it can help someone who perhaps is dealing with a history of personal trauma or traumatic stress, or maybe ongoing stress or stresses that can lead someone towards suicidal thoughts or just experiencing a huge amount of just everyday distress.
So I'll touch on this idea of problem solving. It might not solve the problems.
Yeah.
It might not make them go away. If I might be in an area where the roads authority or the council wants to knock down my house and build a highway. Yep. Guess what? Sorry, spoiler. Therapy's not going to fix that. Yeah. Therapy's not going to save my house, is it?
Yeah.
So what can it do? What is the point? Well, what it can do is help us kind of process some of that in a different way. And I was almost going to say deeper way. I was thinking about maybe in a deeper way, but I'll actually stick with a different way. So any situation in life involves perspectives. Yeah. You and I are having this conversation right here, right now. But we've got completely different perspectives. I'm being really literal about that, Joe.
Yeah,
you're sitting over there looking at me, yeah? And I'm sitting over here looking at you, yeah? It's the same event going on, but we've got very different points of view, very different perspectives.
Because I know I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah, well, apart from that, and I like to indulge that delusion of yours, but that helps me to feel superior, and so we've got different perspectives, different points of view, and there are usually numerous points of view, yeah. And when we're struggling with something, we might go to those blinkers again. I'm going to put the blinkers on. We can get really stuck, and this is particularly where fear and trauma involved. We process things in a very particular way, and our brains process and remember things, or store memories in particular ways, and that can seem like the only way to experience or understand something. Now, that's a survival response, so it's not wrong. It's not unhealthy, but what it can mean is that over time, any survival response is really important. If I'm walking across the road and the car's coming down the road and I'm in the wrong spot, I've got to jump, yeah? I might jump and land and break my leg, yeah? Was it the wrong thing to jump? No, that's the survival response, that instinct that I need to do. But it might mean that I end up carrying with me, carrying in my body or carrying in my mind things that are still impacting on me. Yeah. So the purpose of therapy and the aims of therapy is to be able to actually come into contact with that in a way that's just a little bit safer. And kind of we can talk about reprocessing that or getting different perspectives on that, understanding that, but also coming to terms with that. Now, we know I talked about my fictional house that's going to get bulldozed for the highway. Yeah. While that's approaching, while that's on the table, that's really distressing. Yeah. And I'm going to be really upset and try and stop it. And when it happens, I'm probably going to be mortified. But I probably will move somewhere else. And again, I'm not minimizing this. I'm not dismissing the intensity of people's feelings, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point here. Eventually, I'll get another house. And I'll settle in there. And eventually, hopefully, I'll look back and I'll think, gee, I really like that house. Yeah. And I miss it. But you know what? This house is pretty good too.
Yeah.
Or it might be that was the best house ever and I don't like this one, but at least I've got a roof over my head. Yeah. Or it might be, actually, I thought that house was great, but this one's even better. Yeah. So the process of therapy is about trying to come into contact with things that are unhelpful or whether I'm blocked or stuck or traumatized, or paralyzed in fear, or in hatred or in anger, and trying to approach those in a safe enough way to encounter them in a different way that happened the first time around, or that keeps happening in my mind or in my experience, and to approach those from a different perspective and get a slightly different understanding about them, and start to come to terms with them. That's why I talked about the house. When the loss of that house was real, and really hurtful, and that doesn't no longer exist. But with time, I can come to get a little bit of a separation from that. I'm not denying it happened, but I'm starting to adjust to that, and lets us have a level of adjustment. Yeah, it's like, I'm much less of a hurry now. Much less of a hurry now than I used to be. But I used to want to drive everywhere, at 100 kilometers an hour or 130 kilometers an hour, and guess what? I just had to adjust to the fact that, well, it's not safe. Yeah. Firstly, I stopped doing. I didn't want to do it because I might get a fine. Yeah. I could only think about myself, and I better not do it because I'll get a fine. And over time, I kind of adjusted to the fact, well, it's not safe. Yeah. And later, it doesn't really matter. I can just leave 10 minutes earlier. But so again, I'm not making light of people's past problems or their current difficulties, but just using these as little analogies to illustrate the processes. So engaging in therapeutic process helps us to get different perspectives on our problems, and think about them, coming into contact with them, and talk about them often with another person to help that process. Yeah. It doesn't work for everyone all of the time. It's not the best thing for everybody. And also, as I think you've mentioned, Joe, it's not just a matter of just finding a counsellor or finding a psychologist. It might not be the right person, might not be the right fit at the right time.
Exactly, Daniel. But I love that it kind of helps you to change perspective and find I guess a more helpful perspective into your own experience. It's not denying or minimizing your own experience, but finding a more helpful perspective.
Well, I guess I'll jump in on that though too, Joe. It doesn't necessarily even have to be more helpful. It could just be less unhelpful. Yeah, that's a win as well, and that's where I don't want to lose track of those as well. Yeah, because if I set myself up that I'm going to go to therapy and I'm going to feel better and it's going to help me, I can come away discouraged. If I can accept that, well, if I undertake this, I might be just a little less worse off. I'm going to count that. I'm going to count that as a win.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah.
But also, you and I have been talking about something really important too, Joe. And we've spoken about, when we talk about therapy, I always think of what we call a talking therapy. Seeing a counsellor or a psychologist sitting down talking. They might be like old school psychoanalytic. They might sit behind you when you're on a bit of a couch. They might sit face to face. They might have a desk.
You like to do that. So.
Well, there's all sorts of approaches. But we've talked about walking and walking the dog and things like that. But we've also talked about that mind-body interplay, and that when we're working on trauma, our memories, our trauma events, we carry them in our mind, but we also can carry them in our bodies. And I wanted to be able to talk with you about something we've spoken about before, and
Exactly. And I'm really glad that you brought this up. I mean, first of all, I just want to mention that we've got our guide on powertobehappy.com called Healing Space Melbourne that talks about different therapeutic modalities. Not that you have to do one or the other. You can, different therapists can use like a toolkit of these approaches, but it helps us to understand what some of the things that might be working for you. Is it like is there something that might be more suited to someone who might be more creative, for example, or someone who wants to be more embodied approach? And one of those things that, of course, we're going to dive into now is left right hook. That's also in the Healing Space Melbourne. It's something that is near and dear to my heart for many reasons. That's where my kind of, I guess, journey into healing from trauma began. It's also, how we became friends and how we kind of bonded over that experience. Yeah. So we met through it, right? So let's talk about, I know these days, just so involved in left right hook, and we've got so many great things coming up. So first of all, Daniel, tell us about like left right hook, why it's important, but also what are some of the things we've got coming up that someone can really kind of learn about that and maybe even explore that they might want to join in and give it a try.
Yeah. Well, first of all, left right hook, what is it? And literally, for me, I picture the words, it's left and then it's right with a W as in writing and hook. And it's a deliberate play on words. It's a deliberate pun around referencing boxing. And so, left right hook was developed by someone by the name of Donna Lyon. She's actually an associate professor in film and television, but also Donna's been very open and public in her advocacy and talking about her own experiences as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And Donna actually developed left right hook out of her own experience and her own quest for her in her recovery. And so left right hook combines a process of expressive writing and trauma-informed boxing. Yeah, there's a bit more to it than that, and I'll get to it in a sec, but that's it in an essence if we say, what is left right hook? And so that's been developed into a recovery program and for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and now for groups that involve women and gender diverse participants, they've kind of opened it up more broadly to people who are actually have experienced other forms of gendered violence. Now we'll get to the men in a moment, because that's something, a really exciting development I want to talk about. But we're asking that question, what is left right hook? It's an 8-week. It's peer designed, peer developed, and peer led by survivors of childhood sexual abuse and other forms of gendered violence. And so it's a program that runs across 8 weeks. The sessions are about 2 hours, and they actually spend the first half engaging in some expressive or creative writing. And that's done actually to a timer. It's writing to prompts. It's designed to trigger, or if you like, unlock a bit of unconscious expression, or getting in touch with things that are not necessarily part of our conscious thinking brain, but getting in touch with thoughts and feelings and perhaps experiences that are more subconscious or unconscious. And being able to get those out on the page, it's a way of processing. Yeah, it's a way of bringing trauma or fearful things that are locked in our brains and our bodies out into the daylight, onto the page. And then people are invited to share that within the group, because it's very much a group process. People don't have to share their experiences, of course, but they're invited to. And then after a couple of rounds of the writing, there's a bit of a break. They actually literally run the program in a gymnasium, often a boxing gym. There's no one else there. The other gym people aren't there. It's a protected time. And then they actually put on the boxing gloves and start punching the punching bag, and maybe doing a bit of work, non-contact work with the pads. And that unlocks a way of expressing perhaps trauma, expressing anger, but also connecting and reconnecting with body. We were talking about someone reconnecting with their ability and their art and their creativity as a musician. Well, particularly if people have experienced trauma and early trauma, that's either stored in their body, but also people become disconnected from their body or their physical experience. So the boxing embodies so many things. it's an opportunity to actually connect and reconnect with the body, but also to ground. So, I've got a background in martial arts myself. So when I encountered the boxing, there was a lot of similarities there. And all of those modalities, all of those undertakings involve connecting and grounding. And this is important for being kind of, putting it literally safe enough and stable in the world. So the boxing enables or invites people to connect with their body, experience being whole to a degree and grounded, but also, expressing things physically, including anger. So locating healthy anger and being able to express that and let that out in a safe, consensual, contained kind of environment. And so people can channel their feelings out through their punching, through the physical movement. It wouldn't have to be boxing. Boxing is what made sense to Donna Lyon in her own recovery journey. I mean, it could be done with walking or running or yoga or ballet. It could be any of those things. But there is something quite powerful and transformative having done some of the sessions and looking forward to doing a program, that there's something that connecting with the body and connecting with feelings through the movements, the grounding and the movements of boxing, that can be quite transformative. And I know I said to you just recently, Bo, when I heard about left right hook, I thought it's that boxing and writing thing. Yeah. And then I learned to reorder that. I realized, well, it's actually writing and boxing. And again, that's not me necessarily just being the word police, but the writing is about getting in contact with those internal, intangible thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And I would just want to touch on something we talked about earlier, Daniel, is there's obviously in left right hook, as the name implies, there's the writing, and as you say, that goes first, there's the boxing, that there's activating the bodies, there's bringing your mind into it. But there's also, of course, the community.
There's the third element.
The third element.
I thought it was boxing and writing. And then I discovered that it's writing and boxing. But again, I didn't quite get it because, that third element.
Until I explained it to you.
Yeah, until you explained it to me, right. Yeah, that third element, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that sense of community, right? Especially when you've been through traumatic events, or perhaps ongoing trauma in the past, or it might be occurring in the present, or being brought to you in the mind. It's so important to find that sense of community, whether that's just, and that sense of community doesn't necessarily have to be, a sense of community doesn't have to be that you're constantly talking about trauma, you're constantly talking about these events. Just, I know for me, being around, for example, yourself, and other people we've met through on my own journey, it's just the fact that you are in the presence of someone who has experienced it and has that living experience, that's something so incredibly powerful, because you don't even have to talk about it, because it's already.
Sometimes people say someone else who gets it.
Yeah, it's someone who gets it. It's just implied. It's just felt. It's just this felt sense that exists. There's that shared understanding that doesn't even necessarily require words. That I think is so incredibly transformative, even of its own, right? Even without the fact that you're finding that you kind of a different perspective, and you're bringing your body into it. But all of those things together become really, really powerful. And I know there's, obviously in left right hook, there's different streams, right? You talked about, women and gender diverse survivors. But now let's.
Well, that's what again for the disclosure. You and I, we're almost frauds right now, because we're talking all about left right hook, and we haven't done the program yet. Yeah, but yes. So the incredible thing that I'm excited about, that we're both thrilled about, is that for the very first time we're running a men's program starting in mid-October. It'll actually be in Wyndham City. The venue's in Hoppers Crossing. And it's the first time the program is being made available to men, to male survivors. And so you and I are going to be there in our journey of training as facilitators, but we're also going to be very much taking part in the group. And so that's something that people might be interested in finding out about. With the recruiting for that's closing very soon, but there are still some spaces available in that program. and we'll also be doing some research related to that will, we hope, show similarly as the initial research has with women and gender diverse participants, shown some of the many benefits out of that program. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's so awesome, Daniel. And just like, it's funny because I almost have to talk about it as if I don't know about it, but obviously I do, and I'm there, and I'm also excited to be doing this with you. So Daniel, tell me, if someone wanted to find out about the men's pilot in Wyndham, what would they do?
Yep. So get onto the search engine, just type in left, right hook. Even if you don't spell it the right way, a quick little look around, you'll find it. They've got a really well designed and really helpful web presence. You can find out about the various programs. I'll also take a little meander to the side as well. I mean, they're in developing the program. I think informed by Donna Lyon's background, they actually made a documentary about the first groups of women and gender diverse participants who went through the program. And as you know, it's not news for you, Joe, but yeah, they made a feature-length documentary film, which was premiered at MIF, Melbourne International Film Festival, last year, and actually won the Audience Award. It's also since won an International Documentary Film Award, and is now available, of course, on Netflix. So if people do want to know about the program and get a really first-hand look and feel for it, really recommend looking at that documentary. And there are screenings around the country from time to time, less so now, but there's one coming up on the Sunshine Coast in the near future. So the website's got all of those details. People can put their name down on the mailing list, but also if they click on the link for the programs, there's an expression of interest or an EOI form, and people just put in very basic details, name, postcode, and whether they're interested in a program for men, for women, or for gender diverse participants. And then the amazing staff at Left Right Hook, it's now built on those first beginnings and through the documentary into a charity. So it's an organisation that's growing, and they've got some really wonderful people that are behind that and running things like the website. So yeah, if people have a little bit of a look on the search engine, find the Left Right Hook website, and then have a look for the programs, and they can register an expression of interest.
Fantastic, Daniel. Well, thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your insight and perspective on understanding suicide, finding ways to support yourself, finding ways to support others, but also bringing that into a bigger conversation. How do you care for yourself? How do we care for our health? How do we seek meaningful support? And that's how we kind of ended up talking about Left Right Hook, which is another way to kind of reconnect with yourself, with your own body, reconnect with other survivors, and find that kind of sense of community and belonging. But overall, I want to thank you for your presence and just the things that you do in the world. So, thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for the great work and the advocacy you do, and your Trust Plus One enterprises, and for making this happen, because we wouldn't be having this conversation if you hadn't brought all this together and gotten the two of us in the one spot. So thank you very much. Thanks so much for everything you do, for this opportunity.